The fire of hatred flared up once again in Israel and Palestine in October 2023. It was a fire that was already burning fiercely, coming from ashes that never lost their heat over so many years. The weapons that crossed the Israeli borders had clear purposes that day. Its flames would consume lives indiscriminately, like a wildfire destroying everything it touches. Inside the homes, elderly people who still remembered the horrors they survived shed blood in their own houses. The men who advanced over the corpses filmed their hunt for souls, seeking blood regardless of age or gender. The violations took place in a festival of hatred, with exterminationist premises written into the organization's very founding declaration. And like everything that happens in the region, those actions would cause even more suffering to innocent people of all ages who saw the sky pour destruction over their land. Humanity has a long history that stretches like a road through time. This entire path was shaped by shifting ambitions, by engineers working from different designs. They sent their men to pave the way with layers of hatred carefully laid into the foundations of diplomacy and war. There is no human being who hasn't walked this road, even though no one has a map that properly defines where it's going or where it came from. The map of history has had different designs with its own distortions, the result of the inherent prejudices of those who draw it or those who try to interpret it, or even of interests. In the Middle East, it's always been the same. The territories where Israel and Palestine now lie had their maps drawn by Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Ottomans, and finally the British. They began the process of creating borders more similar to what we have today, a map that stirs paradoxical passions in human beings. This is the same map that leads to an LGBT flag being displayed during a celebration amid a Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. And in this same kind of event, the same flag is hunted down and removed. The flags appear at celebrations of events carried out by individuals renowned for having killed one of their leaders under accusations of homosexuality. It's the kind of stormy feeling that leads a woman to ask terrorists to film, with their phones held horizontally, the death of civilians of any gender or age. A request made to people who, without thinking, have already made threats because of her lifestyle and had already threatened her with death because of it. Of course, these feelings are not limited to just two sides. Christians are often seen supporting Israel's actions no matter what they are. The same Christians who have even thrown bombs at those who made jokes about Jesus Christ, now supporting a state whose official religion vehemently denies the divinity of the one at the heart of Christianity. These passions require some extra explanation of what I just said. It's by no means wanting Christians to be against Jews. It's not wanting any person or movement, regardless of their life or orientation, to hate Palestinians or be hated by them. Never. Not at all. It's simply to point out, without wanting to generalize, how difficult it is to perceive all the political nuances and currents of thought in the world. A region with such a rich and complex history as well as a tragic one, and how many people get inflamed during these discussions. Hatred makes everything harder. It turns any attempt to point out mistakes on both sides into accusations and cries of Islamophobe or anti-Semite. It's one of the foundations of hatred. Accusing, pointing a finger at someone else's face, forgetting about the other three fingers that will point back at your own face. But that's how it's been done for a long time. A story as long as Palestine deserves a special video. However, What will be told in this video is a story about the conflict between Hamas and Israel, right after the terrorist attacks began on October 7th. Only the previous few decades will be covered for a brief explanation of a big problem. Hamas, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, was founded at the end of the 1980s, right when the First Intifada was taking place. One of the major Palestinian uprisings in which they fought with whatever they had against the Israeli forces. By the end of these events, this new organization was already standing out in Gaza's politics, at a time when its political rival, Fatah, was distancing itself from terrorist movements and engaging in talks on creating two states. But Hamas wanted an armed and radical resistance, something that only made negotiations more difficult. On the Israeli side, there were those who had the same deep hatred, wanting to unleash it through actions. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish ultranationalist precisely because he gave in while trying to create peace agreements. The difficulties in the region were many, but they would get much worse. Feeding off dissatisfaction, Hamas thrived while patiently watching the administration of Gaza and the West Bank being handed over to the Palestinians. Israel's withdrawal in 2005 was a crucial moment, which allowed the beacon to be lit, attracting individuals with a single intention once they took power. Hamas was elected in Gaza and became the de facto leader, preventing other organizations from exerting influence. Since then, there have been no other elections that would allow a change of power. Their first actions were to stir the still warm ashes so that the fire of war would once again light up the night in Palestine. War has never stopped coexisting with humanity in the region. It could sleep, but it was like a beast whose breathing could be heard during its slumber, sending chills down the spines of civilians and keeping soldiers on alert. Hamas helped awaken this monster starting in 2007, doing nothing to improve an already difficult situation. Israel began the blockade of Gaza, building fences to prevent Palestinians from entering its territory, justifying it by saying that terrorists were passing through freely. These actions led to the ruin of the Palestinian people. With misery always looming, with death on their heels, suffering gripped the souls of the Palestinians trapped in Gaza, where there was a lack of water, electricity, internet, and jobs. That cold embrace paved the way for whispers that poisoned thoughts with hatred. Hamas fed abundantly on human misery. If their men no longer crossed the fences to blow themselves up in Israeli homes, now their rockets were launched from civilian areas against other civilian areas. Israel countered that. In the 7-week conflict in 2014, 64 of the deceased were Israeli soldiers and 7 were civilians. In Israel, there were victims of rocket attacks and 2,101 were killed in Gaza, of whom, according to the UN, at least 1,468 were killed. Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, claimed that Hamas unnecessarily prolonged the conflicts in the Gaza Strip, which resulted in a high number of fatalities. In addition, he accused the group of maintaining a parallel government in the Gaza region and carrying out illegal executions of dozens of Palestinians. Misery, hunger, and the fire of war were the fertilizer for a harvest of death in Palestine. Hamas got involved in other conflicts, even destabilizing peace negotiations in 2010. As if the actions from the other side weren't enough, once again in 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu took power as the Prime Minister of Israel. A former leader of the Special Forces, Sayeret Matkal, he has been considered, since taking power, a conservative leader and not very favorable to peace with Palestine. His expansion policies in the settlements in the West Bank were continuously criticized. More than that, one of the accusations that weighed most heavily in some circles was his divide and conquer tactic, diminishing the power of the Palestinian Authority and keeping Hamas in Gaza with direct funding from Qatar. One of the arguments used was that it wasn't simply about diminishing Abbas's power, but that it was expected that with this responsibility the organization would free itself from the restrictions. The 2014 war seemed to have dashed those hopes with the death of more than 1,400 Palestinians. Children had their lives and dreams buried forever in the rubble, with only their souls as witnesses to the debate over who killed them, a failed Hamas rocket or an Israeli bomb. Slowly, everything seemed to have stopped. Hamas's fire subsided into a heat that killed more slowly inside Gaza. Israel watched, curiously observing how the enemy seemed to be just a bunch of ragged terrorists who would not attack anymore. A mere terrorist group would not wage open war, especially at that moment when workers from Gaza were crossing the border to work. Hamas's passivity generated criticism from those who supported them. But their leaders just shrugged, seeming satisfied with the flow of money. They were even accused by Fatah of running away with money to live in luxury in Arab world capitals, while poverty persisted in Gaza. If Hamas seemed like a sleeping dragon, it didn't mean that death and war had forgotten Palestine. In the West Bank, in the city of Jenin, the refugee camp began to feel the air grow heavy when the first drone attacks hit. The Israeli troops appeared soon after, with armored vehicles carrying more than 1,000 soldiers. According to the Israeli government, militants were plotting new attacks from the location. The vehicles crossed the narrow streets preparing to deploy the soldiers. CH-53 helicopters flew low over the city, watching as the men were released into the streets.
Observando quando os homens foram soltos pelas ruas. Os soldados
spread out through the refugee camp, checking cars and looking for possible weapons. They advanced into the camp while the population of Jenin watched. They even managed to capture some improvised combat vehicles, probably used by the Jenin brigades, from the groups of fighters who called themselves the local resistance. The clashes with them soon began. The Palestinians prepared for the soldiers' assault. Improvised explosives were placed in the streets to stop the armored vehicles. The Israeli vehicles came under fire as they advanced, underscoring how difficult it was to fight in urban terrain prepared by their opponents. When night fell, the Israeli soldiers were already leaving the armored vehicles, ready for direct confrontation with the local brigades. They had to use the vehicles as cover, alternating positions while the ammunition lit up the night from both sides. The intense gunfire in the poorly lit streets made the fight even harder for the Israeli soldiers against the Palestinians, who knew the territory well. The clashes continued throughout the night, with the troops advancing in large numbers, entering houses by force. The soldiers made progress. Through difficult alleys where any turn could become an ambush, they reached one of their objectives when they surrounded one of the mosques in the refugee camp. The drone strike cleared the area for the soldiers to enter, where they found weapons depots inside the tunnels. According to the Israeli army, terrorists were killed and the operation was a success. Other sources say that the Palestinian fighters escaped through the tunnels, and the Israeli army soon withdrew from Jenin amid protests from the population and accusations of war crimes. Once again, there was talk about the occupations considered illegal in the West Bank, which would cause even more division between the peoples. Hamas protested but did little more than hold a march. Gaza, or the West Bank, had not yet fallen silent or remained quiet after that. Israeli intelligence obtained information about Mustafa al-Kashtuni, one of the leaders of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. The soldiers used civilian cars to enter Jenin and surround the house where the Palestinian leader was. The Israeli report mentions Mustafa's resistance and the injuries to the soldiers when the Palestinians fired back. The man, accused of being a terrorist leader, was wounded in the head, chest, and abdomen. The invasion was carried out quickly, overcoming the last resistance of two men who were taken by the soldiers as prisoners. The Palestinians' account says that Mustafa had surrendered, and even so the soldiers fired. As always, more than one version in an information war. While the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade had conflicts like this in the West Bank, Hamas remained quieter. The year 2023 was complex, with deaths and accusations from both sides, with civilian casualties. From Gaza, workers continue to enter and work in Israel as a sign that things might be improving slightly. In the meantime, while the world watched Ukraine and Russia shed the blood of thousands of soldiers, something more than the nearly 2-year war awakened humanity to a new horror. It was October 7, 2023, when a political organization with an armed wing began its plans. What would be seen that day would not simply be a localized attack by a terrorist group or a resistance movement. It was an army trained with a political foundation with clear intentions in which civilians were not collateral damage in their fight. But part of its target, the flame of Hamas, was crackling once again. It was 6:30 in the morning when the sirens sounded in Israel. The morning was cut by rockets that flooded the skies, accompanying the rising sun while people were still getting ready for their day. Surprised, everyone tried to follow the protocols that could keep them safe. More than 2,000 missiles rained down on the cities. Some say it was more than 5,000, which jolted the Iron Dome, Israel's protection, from its sleep to try to prevent disaster from reaching civilian areas. That was the beginning of a well-planned, well-rehearsed operation, with information gathered from Hamas agents infiltrated among Palestinian civilians who entered Israel. Land, water, and sea were filled with the fire of Hamas. They prepared themselves at sunrise, beginning their flight into terror, confident in their planning. The Hamas soldiers flew along with the rockets, heading to cause more suffering. Many who saw it could not believe it. At a party in the middle of the desert, hundreds of young people danced without a care. In the sky, paragliders circled, seeming to be part of the celebration. The young people filmed, excited by the surprise provided by the organizers, but they were the ones who landed. Men with a different purpose, landing with steady feet and hands gripping rifles. Blood was already spilling on the ground when panic set in, causing many to run desperately toward their cars. The bullets danced in the air, hitting people who were fleeing in desperation. The bodies falling to the ground could not be mistaken for combatants, whether by their clothing or by their empty hands, except for the car keys they held showing where they intended to run. The police officers tried to protect and organize the people, saving as many lives as they could, but they were few and unprepared in the face of advancing soldiers. Those who hid in bathrooms didn't stand a chance. Hamas made sure to bring death into every stall, not caring who was inside. Salvation wasn't guaranteed even for those in cars. Hamas set up roadblocks to kill. Obeying the orders to stop wasn't an attempt to avoid conflict, but simply putting your neck in the wolf's jaws. 260 bodies fell on the desert sand while Hamas men walked through the festival of death, waiting for orders for the next target. Those were not simply disorganized terrorists. They were trained soldiers with plans for more disaster. Fences and walls that Israel put around Gaza were broken at the same time as the militants' flights cut through the sky. The sun was rising in the sky to witness the horrors of that day. Under this light, Hamas soldiers took advantage of being considered just a terrorist group and advanced, destroying everything in their path. The planning allowed their fighters and men to pass through the land, through the openings, to directly find their first targets, civilians. They invaded the homes of residents who had to leave in a hurry, and when they didn't leave, they met death, that is, if they weren't kidnapped. The way Hamas used its weapons left no room for the conflicting accounts that arise in so many other cases of war. No one would say they were civilians caught in the crossfire. Miscalculated target, civilians used as shields, individuals who may or may not be considered combatants. Men and women, Old people and children were gunned down with repeated shots so explicitly that opinions would only be divided into two, whether revenge and direct attacks on civilians were justified. Survivors from the site died along with more than 1,000 individuals. Another 200 individuals were kidnapped and taken to Gaza, all filmed by the soldiers themselves. The military forces, blind to the advance of Hamas, did not fare well to protect themselves from the wave of terror that was devouring any lives in its path. Inside a base, the Israeli soldiers crowded together unarmed as the enemy approached. The cries of Allah Akbar were getting closer and closer while some of the soldiers were still trying to put up a disorganized resistance. The bases with tanks and all the equipment were nothing in the face of the surprise attack. The AKs were the only sound echoing along with the shouts of the Hamas fighters. The tanks weren't much help. Those armored vehicles without infantry support couldn't do much when caught by surprise. Sometimes you could hear the desperation in their movements. While they were under attack, the Merkava tanks became prey for the drones. Hamas sent their birds into flight using ammunition adapted from RPG-7 rounds or, according to some sources, 85mm anti-tank ammunition. The soldiers who survived suffered when the enemy infantry rushed in to take their lives. Even tanks farther away felt the weight of the offensive when the RPGs pierced their armor and turned them into large, useless, burning hulks. The base walls didn't hold back any of the enemies. Grenades were thrown into places where the Israeli soldiers were huddled together, still caught by surprise. Death found them in the same way that the drones found the men as they searched for defensive positions for the fight. None of them expected that the enemies would keep their relentless eyes on them from the sky, only to rain fire down on them from the clouds. All that was left was to drag the wounded men and look for protection, some way to escape that hell. Hamas kept advancing without any organized resistance from Israeli forces. Suddenly, one of the so-called best armed defense systems in the world seemed like nothing in the face of the fury of the attack. The images were increasingly devastating. Reports were coming in from people who had learned about their relatives being killed, from recordings on the social media accounts of the deceased made by Hamas itself. The blood reddened more and more of Israeli territory, accompanied by the advancing enemy's overwhelming hatred. In a not at all subtle way, Hamas and many of its supporters denied so many of the atrocities after having recorded them. Yes, after the soldiers themselves had recorded them, going so far as to show images of babies and children, with their fighters cynically saying it was all a lie and that they were treating them well. In a clear message, when Israel began its counterattack, the horror of war would not end. More stories would need to be told. Israel's reaction would be brutal to the point that it would turn part of global public opinion against the country. In the end, more civilians would end up dead on both sides, with bombs falling and the souls of children, old people, women, and men disappearing amid rubble and dust, while tears and more hatred would appear on the faces of those watching the ruins. Thus the war persists, with man's misery feeding the white smile of death.